Book 7, The Soldier in the Middle of the World, Chapter 34. I'm being released? Shin heard the floorboards moving and he looked up. Day 6 behind him? 4 or 5 more to go. He took a deep breath and steeled himself for another morning. It was morning, right? Shin stuffed the blanket into the gap and watched as Healy came down the ladder again, lantern in his teeth. He set it down and retrieved Shin's morning rations. The soldiers above closed up the floor, and Healy whispered his usual greeting. "You all right?" Shin nodded. "I'm all right." "Good," Healy whispered back. In a louder tone he said, "Your bread, your jerky, and your water. If you want bigger rations at dinner, tell us about the roots." Healy already had his jacket off and was retrieving various foods stashed in his pockets. Shin smiled in admiration. No one could tell the sergeant major was bulked up with rations. Then again, no one at the fort knew the sergeant major used to be a master thief as a teen. Last night, Pug had told him that the second time he incarcerated Po Healy, he patted him down first. Even though the chief of enforcement was sure he'd retrieved everything from the 15-year-old, Major Shin still found several more pieces of jewelry and even a knife secreted in his clothing. At the time, Pugga was sure, by the smirk on young Po's face, that he still had even more that no one found. Shin didn't know if he should label it ironic or a blessing, that the same skills Po Healy mastered as a young man trying to sneak goods past Pere and Shin were the same skills that were now saving his grandson by the same name. He was sure there was no way he could have survived on the starvation rations he was given. He knew he was losing weight, but he was doing all he could to not lose strength. Each day he spent time doing push-ups against the walls and jogging in place. His ribs were mending adequately, and the bruise on his shin was tolerable. He stretched, he jumped, he did everything he could that Colonel Shin recommended to keep his body toned and ready. There was no way Thorne would let him stay behind at the fort when the army left. There might be a possibility that, depending on how the forest and the canyon looked, he could slip away and run to safety. Funny how something he didn't want to do for the past year and 9 moons was all that he wanted to do now. Healy handed him shriveled berries and nuts, and Shin said loudly as he stashed them in the gap, "I can't tell you anything more than I did yesterday, sir." Healy made a quiet noise in his throat and held up a finger. From some inner pocket of his jacket he produced a thick piece of sweet bread wrapped in a kerchief. He grinned as Shin's mouth dropped open and his lips smacked together eagerly. "From the General and Amory's own table," Healy whispered and handed it over. Shin couldn't bear to shove it into the gap without taking a large bite first. It was the most delicious thing he'd ever eaten. "Can't tell me anything more?" Healy said loudly. "I can't remember, sir," Shin garbled with crumbs on his chin. "Then maybe I won't remember to bring you dinner." "Sir, please." "The roots, Private," Healy shouted. "Sir, there is another route. Used in the past. It was much safer." Healy raised his eyebrows in concern. Shin nodded to assure him. "Why have you not told us this before?" he demanded. I didn't remember until now. I was never on it, but it went past Moorland." "Moorland is under 500 feet of mountain, Shin." "But, sir, please, it was past Moorland. Maybe if scouts were sent to the crater, they could find the route around it. Salem is maybe 15 miles behind what was Mount Deceit." Healy's mouth hung open in surprise. "Really?" he breathed. Shin shrugged. "Roughly," he whispered quickly. "I never went on it, but it'd give Thorne a new lead to chase." Healy glanced upward, knowing the guards were listening in. "So how do we get through the rock, Shin?" he yelled. "Sir, I don't know. The only way may be over the rock." Healy sighed. "Can't get horses over the rock, Shin." "Maybe they can make it over Moorland. There should be no rock there, and maybe the new hill has settled enough for horses to traverse it." "Good diversion," Healy whispered. Sir, Shin said loudly, if you'd considered releasing me, I could probably find— No! Healy bellowed. But sir, please, I'm so hungry. Feed me today, and I can help try looking at Moreland. We don't need help looking, Shin. Half the army is already arriving. The other 37,000 will be here in just days. What we need is solid information, soldier, not ideas and speculations. Guards, I'm ready to come back up. Sir, do I get dinner? Shin pleaded. Healy winked reassuringly at him, but barked, I'll decide that later. He checked the buttons on his jacket to make sure all of them were fastened as the floorboards above them moved again. A few minutes later, when Shin's hole became dark again, he whispered, How was that, Pugga? Very good. Thorn's getting frustrated with the lack of progress. His men actually found the last remaining footpath, but since it won't accommodate horses, he didn't even have them finish exploring it. He'll jump on the possibility of the moorland route. That should keep him occupied for a couple of days, I'm guessing. By then, the rest of the army will be arriving, which will be a huge mess to keep him busy for a couple more days, and then it will be the 30th. The day he plans to leave to find Salem. Then what will happen? There's only one possibility. Over the boulders. Shin released a low whistle. I'm guessing at least half of the army will have a hard time climbing over that rock. Even with everyone losing weight the past few seasons, there are still some very large bellies in the world. He heard a cosmic chuckle. Well, don't tell them that. They like to believe the bulk is muscle. But since they don't have any real muscle, they don't know that muscle doesn't jiggle. Shin snorted and reached into the gap for his sweetbread. He sniffed it, sighed in sheer pleasure, and took another big bite, savoring the rare flavor of sugar. That's what I caught him eating the first time I apprehended him. Who? Shin garbled with a mouthful. Po Healy. It was the crumbs that gave him away. I knew garters didn't steal food, but teenage boys would. Po still had something like that smeared on his chin when I first nabbed him. Now he's stealing it for you. I always wondered what kind of a father Po would have been. Maybe this is a glimpse into that. Shin smiled into the darkness and shoved the rest of the thick bread into his mouth. Moreland, are you sure, Po? Positive, General. Thorn exhaled. I suppose that could make sense. The Garters were taking over Moreland before we blew them out of there. They may have had a route somewhere. Do we want to send a contingency to try to scale the hill? Healy asked. Thorn looked out at the command tower windows toward the west. Another 5,000 soldiers were arriving in Edge and setting up camp in the barren farmland. A few listened to instructions, thousands more didn't, but by evening the hope was that the 2,500 tents would be properly in place. Perhaps fewer bodies in the way of establishing camps would make things easier, Healy suggested, as he gazed out at the terrain which was swarming with men in blue trying to set up sheets of white, as if a cloudy sky had fallen to the ground and was trying to sort itself. Possibly, Thorn muttered. 500 men. Send them by horseback if we can find enough animals. See if they can climb the hill and find anything to the north of it. Excellent idea, sir, Healy agreed. Has he earned his dinner? Thorn sighed. Yes, he has. He's also earned a visit. A visit, sir? Thorn watched the attempts of tent raising and scowled at the failures. He's going to meet 2 new friends this evening. Who, sir? Are you sure that's a good idea? The dungeon is getting rather foul. Bring him out of it temporarily. He can take his dinner in the records room with his friends. Friends? Healy had never heard Shin mention he had friends. No one had even come asking after him. Yes, the general continued in a drawl. 2 brave young men who pleaded with me to have some compassion, who had admired the lieutenant when he spoke kindly to them last year. I was so surprised by their earnestness that I actually gave in. They adore him, Poe, and they deserve to meet him. His father can extend to him this little bit of kindness." Healy was confused. And what are their names?" "I believe Beaver designated them Buddy and Pal. If the sergeant would learn to memorize people's names—" Thorne shook his head as he watched the fumbling soldiers in the distance. "But then again, he's one of the best security sergeants available right now, according to his uncle." Healy internalized a sigh. There were no admirers of Shin, but 2 new spies of General Thorne. With any luck, they'd be as inept as the rest of the conscripted army. And hopefully Shin was ready for them, but Healy didn't know how to warn him. "Visitors?" Shin asked Healy in amazement. He looked quickly around himself before cringing. "Not here, but up there." Healy nodded to the hole above them. Shin was flabbergasted. "I'm being released?" Healy sighed. "No, just given a reprieve, temporarily." "I'll take it." Healy pulled out a set of keys and unlocked Shin's chains. "Then follow me up." Shin climbed the ladder eagerly, not really caring who was at the top, but ready to gulp in fresh air and maybe see a bit of daylight. Although it was dinner time, he assumed, there still might be some glimmer of real light coming through the doorway. As his head came up through the hole in the floor, he took a deep breath and closed his eyes. Why had he never before realized how glorious fresh air was? He pulled himself out of the hole and stood. Instinctively, he looked to the door, hoping to see light filtering in from the receiving area. While the door was closing, thanks to one of the many guards, he did glimpse light, real light, not the candlelight of the records room, but the sun. It was enough to get him through another day. The sound of throat clearing brought his attention back to the room. There stood a sergeant, maybe 30 years old, with dark skin and eyes watching him expectantly, and 2 pale, younger soldiers trying not to wince at his odor. They had the gangly, awkward look of boys in mid-growth spurt, their head sizes not yet matching the rest of their bodies. They were seated at a small table that was set for a meager dinner. "Private Shin, I'm Staff Sergeant Beavid," the dark-skinned man said. "This here is, Buddy and Pal." Shin smiled at the soldiers. "Who is who?" The soldiers looked at each other and shrugged. One raised his hand. "I guess I'm Buddy. That must be Pal." "All right," Shin said slowly. "And you're here because—" "Your admirers," Beavid told him. "The reason you've been allowed out of the dungeon for dinner is because of these 2 brave young men." Shin raised his eyebrows and looked at them in wonder. The 2 boys produced smiles that weren't completely authentic on their pimply faces. Shin gave them another smile that he'd learned from his grandfather, appropriate for dinners. "Really?" Beavid nodded. "They were working alongside Thorne this afternoon and expressed their concern for your well-being. I'm not entirely sure what they said to him, but the next thing I know, Thorne's granting them their request to meet you and allow you a meal at their real table and chair. Extraordinary privates, Shin." "Indeed," Shin said, his muscles aching to sit properly in a chair. "I see I owe you an incredible debt of gratitude. Thank you. I only wish I smelled better for you. Maybe dressed completely, bathed, had a comb." The 2 young men laughed uproariously, as if they'd heard the funniest joke in the world. Shin blinked and smiled. He glanced over at Healy, trying to send him a message with his eyes. Healy nodded. "Seems everything is under control here. I'll excuse myself and allow you 3 to get better acquainted. Staff Sergeant, I'm sure the 6 guards posted outside this door can handle anything that may happen in here, although I'm sure Shin will do nothing to cause him to not have this privilege again." Shin was sitting down to the table but stopped. "Again? I get to do this again?" Healy smiled thinly. "If all goes well, yes. I'm telling you, Shin, these young men had quite the effect on General Thorne. You might be able to take every dinner here until you're released. They're very powerful." Shin smiled thinly back, having caught the message, and turned to the young privates. "I'd love to hear what you said to the general." Their plastered smiles began to crack, and they glanced at each other nervously. Sergeant Beavid's eyes narrowed. Buddy finally spoke, or maybe it was Pal. That's not really important right now. What we really want to know is, how are you doing? We can't imagine what it must be like down there." "Here," said Pal, or Buddy. He pushed over a plate and removed the cloth that was covering it. "Please eat, then we can talk. Maybe Sergeant Major Healy will be slow in returning so that we can have some time." Shin and Healy exchanged looks, Shin's glance assuring Healy that he understood just how powerful these boys were, and Healy shut the door. With ravenous gusto, Shin dug into his dinner of warm stew and bread. When Healy returned over half an hour later, it was to see the two privates sitting across the table trying to subtly shield their noses, and Beavid in the corner trying to be inconspicuous. Shin was telling them about his experience in the eruption and how he was so grateful to find General Thorne. It was a miracle," he was saying earnestly. "Now I can understand why the Creator chose him to find the new guide. The guide! I can hardly wait for Guide Lanner to return with the army." Buddy and Pal nodded and glanced at each other. Interesting," Buddy said distantly. "But I think I was asking you about your childhood, what your home was like." Shin's eyes went blank. "Oh, that's right," he said slowly. "I forgot. How'd I end up talking about Leonard Croup?" He shrugged. "Sorry about that. I just haven't had anyone to talk to for so long that I'm just excited to talk to anyone about anything. Have you ever had that feeling? The need to just say words and make noises, just to hear your own voice, to know you're still alive, and that other people are still alive and breathing, and that the whole world is still going on, singing and talking and laughing and—" Healy cleared his throat loudly from the open door. Shin stopped and regarded Healy with disappointment at his arrival. But Sergeant Beavid looked over at him in relief, as did the young soldiers. They stood up quickly as Healy came into the room. "Time's up, Shin. Sorry." Shin stood up reluctantly and smiled at his two companions. "Thank you," he said fervently. "Thank you for the dinner, for the conversation, for the chance to sit like a real person, for—" "Shin," Healy said sharply, "enough. Guards, get in here and open the floor again." A few minutes later, Healy refastened the chain loosely around Shin's wrist and ankle, giving him as much room to move as possible. As he worked, he whispered, "How did it go?" "Couldn't you tell by their faces?" Shin whispered back. "I talked nonstop, but never said anything they wanted to hear. Tell Thorne I love my new buddies and pals." Healy patted Shin's arm and grinned. "Good work, Shin." He paused. I've been wondering, did they call you Perrin in Salem?" Shin looked down. "Young Pere." "Because there was an old Pere?" "In a way, yes. Not that long ago." Healy exhaled heavily. "Oh, so much I want to know. So much you better not tell me. I'm sorry I asked." Shin looked him in the eyes. "He really liked you, you know. He was always worried about you after you were transferred from Edge." Healy held up a hand. "Don't say any more, Shin. Don't tempt me with information I might accidentally divulge." He jingled the chains. "Just a few more days, son," he whispered, and Shin didn't mind one bit hearing him use that word. "Hang in there, young Pere." "Thank you, Poe." For the next few evenings, Sergeant Beavid watched as Shin entertained his new friends with rambling stories about living in the mansion, riding his horse, meeting the people of Edge, counting the bags of grain, and everything else that was dull, tedious, and current. But what they wanted was exciting, unexpected, and in the past. No matter what they asked, Shin always drifted into something else. Each day Beavid rehearsed with Buddy and Pal questions that only a raving idiot would misunderstand. But apparently living in the dark, stinking dungeon had turned Shin into such an idiot. Each evening he babbled nonstop, and even once broke out into a song about a buzzing butterfly. Then he giggled for several minutes, while the two privates smiled uncomfortably. After dinner on the 28th, Beavid trudged up to the command tower steps to General Thorne's office and reluctantly knocked on the door. When he heard the command, "Enter," he took a preparatory breath and stepped into the office. Thorne's steady gaze stopped him. "Well?" "He really likes sweetbread. Went on about it for at least 15 minutes. He also likes pie. Peach is his favorite. Then berry, then apple, unless the apples are really tart that year. Then apple is his second favorite, and berry is his third. He hates pumpkin pie, though. The texture is all wrong. Would you like to know why?" Thorne groaned. "Ugh, no, thank you." He looked out the darkening window. "Tell me, Beavid, is he sincere or is he playing us?" Beavid shrugged. "I really don't know, sir. I never met him before this. He certainly seems sincere. He hugged the privates today. He was so happy to see them. I thought they were going to pass out because of the stench," he chuckled. He stopped when he realized he was the only one chuckling. Thorne shifted his gaze. "He's very clever, Beavid. He can read a situation and manipulate it for his own purposes. That's how I'm sure we share the same blood." He looked at the black window again. "Tomorrow is his last day down there, and I'm running out of time. The hill is impassable. There's no path through the rock anywhere. We're going to have to climb over it. If we could just get from him the distances, the routes. This strategy hasn't worked as Slither anticipated it would." Thorne went silent, brooding. Beavid waited for him to speak. "Preserve Shin," he kept saying. "We'll need him. He'll talk. He'll tell us everything if you treat him just so. Ha! Slither's no longer worth the grain he's eating. Why do I bother listening to anyone else but myself?" Beavid cleared his throat to remind the general he wasn't alone. When Thorne finally looked at him, Beavid spoke tentatively. "Sir, I have some thoughts about Shin. He can't concentrate on anything for more than a moment, and seems more starved for attention than for food. If he does know the distance, in his current condition he can't articulate anything of use. He doesn't act like an angry prisoner, but like a lost puppy, glad to be found again." Thorne scoffed. "Lost puppy. How does he look? Skinny?" Beavid shrugged again. "He's pretty large, but I guess he's lost some weight. The guards say they hear him doing things down there, and counting as he does them, maybe exercising." Thorne tapped his lip with his finger. "1 day left. What can I do to him to get him to talk with only 1 day left?" Beavid shifted. "Sir, that's what I'm getting at. I don't think we need to get him to talk. He might reveal himself in another way. His eyes may give him away." Thorne turned back again. "His eyes?" "Yes, sir. I've noticed that men frequently look at the very thing they're trying to ignore. Shin's not concealing anything very well right now. He's unguarded, like an open book, showing us everything about himself. I have a feeling that once we get him up beyond the boulders, and if we watch his eyes, they'll tell us exactly where to go. Who knows, maybe in his eagerness to be freed from the dungeon, he'll lead us to Salem, just like that lost puppy." "Huh," Thorne grunted. "Seems to be our only option. You better hope you're correct, Beavid. Or actually, Slither better hope. because if this fails, I'm coming back here and killing the fat old man myself." Shin waited anxiously all the next day, the 29th. His breakfast came from Healy on time, but the sergeant major didn't know when he would be released. "Rather frenzied out there, Shin," he explained as he hurriedly unloaded the morning's extra rations. "Edge is soon to be a city of nearly 90,000 people. Soldiers have set up their tents too far away from each other, so they have to snug them up again to make room for the rest of the army filing in. Naturally, that's causing some violence. Already we've had more than a dozen men die from trying out their new swords and long knives on each other. It's just going to get worse as the rest of the army arrives this afternoon. Some of the farmers are arguing with the soldiers. Horses are wandering untethered. We received news of a small stampede on the eastern side of the village just before I got your breakfast. A surprising number of women have accompanied their men, too. Seems they didn't want to sit around waiting. The general wanted 4,000 women, but more than 15,000 are already here. There are rumors that even more will be coming once the army leaves. And where do they think they're sleeping?" Healy exhaled in frustration as he put on his jacket to button it. "Today I almost envy you, young Pere," he whispered. "You have more room than anyone else. You don't have to worry about stampedes, and no women will be sneaking in here to sleep tonight. Wait, maybe they will, once they realize who's down here all alone." "Even with the smell?" Shin squinted. "Even with the smell. It's not going to smell much better up there by tomorrow. No one wants to dig latrines, but everyone wants to use one. Edge is going to be in ruins by tomorrow. This is the most undisciplined army I've ever seen." A thought was birthed in Shin's mind. Undisciplined? Guess that comes from so little training. Or might they be insubordinate because they don't believe in General Thorne? Healy inspected his uniform. "Don't know, Shin, and I don't like the direction your thoughts are going." He looked up and rolled his eyes. No. You've got to be kidding me. Young Pere, after all this time you've learned nothing?" "What do you mean?" Shin asked with his best innocent face. Healy gestured in exasperation. "I saw your scrawls all over that slagging piece of paper, General Pere and Shin. You signed your death decree that night. You know that? Do you know how close I came to losing my position arguing for your life? Don't you dare thank me like this. I just spent 10 days risking my own neck smuggling you food to keep you alive. Don't you dare go up there and lose that life tomorrow by thinking you can take over from Thorne. You'll die, you know that? There's no way you could ever succeed. He's always 3 steps ahead of everyone. And who would listen to you anyway, young Pere?" Sir, Shin said with an easy smile. "I know I'm a nobody. I was just curious about the state of the army, that's all. Besides, what in the world could I possibly do now? Honestly, Poe, look at me." "Just remember that, young Pere." He sighed and patted Shin on the shoulder. "I'll see what I can do about getting you out and getting you a bath. I already have your cot ready in my quarters, although 3 more officers are sleeping in there too. All of this may take a little time, though. I've got huge messes up there to straighten out. Just hang on, young Pere." "I will, sir, and thank you, Poe, for everything." The day moved remarkably slowly. Shin kept watch above him, waiting for the floorboards to move. They didn't. Not through the morning, not through the afternoon. Maybe it wasn't even afternoon yet. He was so eager to get out he was struggling to keep track of time. Pug had told him repeatedly to go through Lilla's repertoire of songs or recite all the passages he could remember from the writings, but as soon as he started he was sure he heard a noise above him, so he'd stop, hold his breath in anticipation, and be disappointed yet again. "It's a mess up there, young Pere. Poe's in charge of sorting it all out. Settle in for a long wait." "He can send someone else to get me," Shin said, watching above. "He could have told those guards up there to release me. He's supposed to keep watch over you. How about I tell you a story about—" But Shin couldn't concentrate on listening to anything besides the wood scraping above his head. A thought kept rising in his mind, and although he suspected he should probably fight it, in his boredom he entertained it instead. The army didn't believe in this ridiculous notion of an unknown village. They were there only because they were ordered to be there. And even if they did find such a village, how could it hold so much food for everyone? No, in a few days the army of Idemia would not only be insubordinate, but treasonous. It'd become frustrated with following Thorn up steep and exhausting mountains. Surely it'd only take a few days for the majority of the army to begin to wonder if someone else couldn't be a better leader. Maybe someone Thorn feared so much that he locked him up in his dungeon until it was time to leave. Maybe someone who was a descendant of the last great leader the world ever saw. Don't think it, young Pere. Ignore that little fantasy. I know you hear me, young Pere. I see your eye twitching. Just don't think it. There's a much better life awaiting you. Eventually his stomach, which was used to being fed twice a day, grumbled loudly enough to disturb his planning and fantasies. It had to be dinner time, but still no Healy. Still no movement above. He felt in the gap to make sure there wasn't a nut or morsel of bread he neglected to find in his earlier inspections, and he drained the last of his water before shoving the flask into the gap. And he waited. Long past dinner time, there was still nothing. Go to sleep, young Pere. Pass the time that way. He wrapped the blanket around him in defeat as he leaned against the timbers. Thorn was doing this on purpose, he was sure. Get him full of hope, then snatch it all away. Yet another page to write in his memoir about the world's most ridiculous leader. The itching in his eyes told him it was night again, and no one had come to retrieve him. He was careful not to be angry with Healy. Poe had been nothing but exceptionally helpful for the past 10 days. Something big must have been happening to keep him away. No, this neglect had General Thorn written all over it. Exactly what kind of emotion it was meant to provoke in Shin, he wasn't sure. He had to play this correctly, even though he wasn't sure what kind of game they were playing now. He closed his eyes, although by now he thought he could have slept with his eyes open, it was so dark either way. Where'd he get that blanket? I don't know. Maybe it's supposed to be part of the dungeon. Dingy enough that it looks like part of the dungeon. Shin blinked rapidly to realize there was a light coming down the ladder. He sat up quickly and considered stashing the blanket, but it had already been seen. He rubbed the sleep out of his eyes to focus on the bodies reaching the bottom of the pit. His heart sank in disappointment that it wasn't Healy, but immediately began to see what Thorn was playing at. "You're awake. Good," Buddy said. "Guess what? You're free." Shin's eyebrows went up. "It's true," Pal assured him as he reached the bottom, coughing at the stench. He pulled a set of keys out of his pocket. "Say goodbye to your miserable home, Shin," Sergeant Beavid called down from the top of the pit, "because you'll never see this slagging place again. Ready for a bath?" "Oh yeah, I'm ready," he said, getting to his feet. Buddy and Pal scowled as they undid his chains. Shin hoped they wouldn't notice how loosely they'd been wrapped around his wrist and ankle. He rubbed his flesh for good show. "Let's go." "Yes, let's," agreed Buddy, as he motioned for Shin to start climbing the ladder. He glanced around him, decided he would not miss that place, and climbed as quickly as his tired, hungry body would let him. He had sunshine to see. He reached the top of the ladder, stood up, and headed for the door. Several guards were there with swords drawn. Each pulled the same grimace as they regarded him. "Hold on, Shin," Beavid said. "You go nowhere without the 3 of us." Of course," he said, looking past the guards, disappointed that he saw only darkness. "What time is it?" "Probably about 1 a.m., Beavid told him, as Buddy and Pal came out of the hole gulping fresh air. Shin sagged. "It's 1 a.m. The 30th day of planting? Would you rather we send you back down and retrieve you later in the morning? Sir, no, Buddy exclaimed. He's just disappointed it's so late at night. Right, Shin? Shin nodded. Yes, I was hoping for light. Pal laughed sadly. Well, if it's light you want, we could take you to the eastern part of the village. Most of it's on fire right now. Fire? Beavid nodded in disgust. You'd think soldiers would know how to properly establish a campfire, wouldn't you? But no, we have to be too eager to cook our meager rations, so we build monstrous fires that quickly get out of control. Sergeant Major Healy has been running from one disaster to another all day, and now it looks like it'll be all night. Pal and Buddy here pleaded with General Thorne to release you to our care, and your father finally relented. It seems he wanted to be here to bring you out, but he's busy directing the firefighting efforts. The smell of smoke now reached Shin's nose. Well, then, I thank you for coming to get me. You truly have an extraordinary way with General Thorne, don't you? Maybe you can teach me your secrets? Get me back into his good graces? Buddy and Pal smiled nervously. Maybe after your bath. A few minutes later, Shin submerged his body into a large trough set up in the washing area of the barracks. Usually soldiers stood under pipes with holes that poured down water, but obviously Beavid felt a soaking in warm water was in order. He appreciated that, because since deceit, the warm springs that fed the village had gone cool. Someone had heated up this water just for him. He couldn't control his tears of gratitude and relief as he plunged himself entirely under the water. He remembered when he was 8 years old and was baptized in the river by his father. That was the earliest age children could fully commit to being Salemites, to commit to taking on each other's burdens, to comfort those around them, to live as the Creator desired them to live, to follow His promptings. Shin had failed at pretty much all of that. But there was something else he remembered, the look on his grandfather's face when he came out of the water. His eyes were glistening as he said, "Now, young Pere, you are pure and clean. The day I was baptized was the day the Creator said to me, 'Here, start again. I'm giving you another chance. Best day of my life.'" Those words didn't mean anything to an 8-year-old, but as he shivered in the blanket his mother wrapped around him, those words reverberated in his head, seeping deeply into him, so that they could resurface today. As he held his breath under the water, he wished he could have heard his father's prayer again, be baptized again, get yet another chance. Today, he was ready to try to be a true Salemite for once, to listen to the Creator, almost. Because listening would mean first praying to the Creator, and he didn't feel ready to do that yet. He was too filthy still to approach Him. But he hoped his longing at that moment was like slipping a note under the door to paradise, saying, "I'm planning to come back. Just let me get more ready." "You're ready now, young Pere. He makes you ready. That's what He does." He stayed completely submerged for nearly half a minute, pondering those words and trying to allow every inch of his body soak off the last 10 days. When he finally came up for air, he saw Buddy and Pal coming to the trough, worried. We thought you drowned in there or something." Shin smiled and took the bar of lavender soap Pal handed him. "I could always make my friends nervous that way. No one can hold their breath longer than me. Once I fell into a freezing pond, and they didn't try to retrieve me for almost a minute because they thought I was fake drowning. It was the only time I wasn't." His smile faded, and he stared at the water. He hadn't thought of his near drowning since his first day in Edge. Now, on what might be his last day there, it flooded back to him. His new friends didn't know what to make of his sudden change in demeanor. "Well," Buddy said shortly, "enjoy your bath. We'll be waiting outside. You have a change of clothes on that stool in the corner." "We're tossing these?" Pal said, picking up his rancid undershorts and shirt and holding them at arm's length away. Into the fire. When they left, Shin slumped down into the now soapy water. You were there, Pugga, he whispered into the room, lit only by a couple of candles. That second night, I dreamt about falling into the pond, about dying. You were sitting there by the river, weren't you? After I and Lolo. He closed his eyes as the pain and stupidity of that evening flowed over him. I was, young Pere. Keep washing. I hope they brought you enough soap. Half an hour later, Shin emerged from the washroom wearing new underclothing and his old uniform, which smelled as if it, too, had been recently washed. Even the shin patch seemed brighter than normal. It was fantastic to be dressed and clean again. Well, mostly clean. Although he'd scrubbed every inch of his body and did his hair 3 times, he knew a faint stench still emanated from him. It would have been impossible to erase every odor in just one bathing, but already he felt like a new man. Buddy and Pal smiled and nodded at his transformation from criminal to private, then handed him a razor so he could shave off the rough beard that was growing in splotches on his face. When he completed that task, he allowed himself to look at himself in the mirror. He'd lost weight, his cheeks were thinner, but it looked good on him. His hair was longer, but smoothed back and tucked over his ears to be barely within the standards of the army. His eyes were... He stopped, surprised. He could look into his eyes, and they looked back. So often he'd found it hard to see himself, as if he were looking deep into his soul and was terrified by what he'd find. But tonight he wanted to see what was there. And what he saw was someone a little lost, but finally on the right track. He also saw his grandfather looking back at him. He suddenly remembered the ruins of their burned house outside of the fort. Despite all that had happened to it, the foundation was still there and strong, and something new could be built upon it. Then he understood. He still had a foundation, and something new could be built for him. That's why he could finally look himself in the eyes, because in a few hours, young Pere would be starting for home. Ready for bed, Shin? A voice broke him from his gaze. Sure, he stammered. Could I get something to eat first? I haven't had anything since breakfast yesterday. Buddy and Pal glanced at each other. General Thorne was adamant that you take your breakfast with him in the morning. There's really nothing available right now. Shin nodded sadly and turned to the water pump where he had just finished shaving. Then I'll just get a quick drink. Several minutes later, once young Pere was so full of water he could hear it sloshing in his empty belly, he went with them to the officers' quarters. Sergeant Beavid was waiting at the main doors and escorted him to Healy's room. You should be able to get about 5 hours sleep before breakfast. You're lucky. No one else is here yet. Everyone else is fighting the fires except for me. I get to watch you. I promise, sir, I'm doing nothing but sleeping. You might as well sleep, too, here in the hallway. Don't tempt me, Shin. But I've got relief coming soon. Shin stumbled into Healy's quarters and immediately recognized his cot on the opposite side of the room. Tears welled in his eyes as he rushed over to it and flopped on his belly. The air was fresh, the cot was soft, his body was clean. He could lay flat. The room was peaceful. How could anything in paradise be better than this? Well, you look so much better I hardly recognized you. Young Pere heard the words murmured softly over his head. He opened his eyes and saw the dim image of Sergeant Major Healy. Don't get up, Poe told him. I'm just finally getting in and to bed. You have a few hours still to sleep. Need some jerky? He pulled a chunk of dried meat from his pocket. Please, young Pere reached up to take it. Poe held it just out of reach. Promise me you won't do anything, and I mean anything, stupid today, or tomorrow, or the next day, or the next. Is this the only way I get the jerky? Yes, I promise. Say it, young Pere. I promise not to do anything stupid ever again. I owe my life to Qualipo Healy. Young Pere grinned. I promise not to do anything stupid ever again. I promise my life to Qualipo Healy, who's about to give me some jerky. Po handed it to him. Good boy. If you break that promise, I'll get that jerky back from you the hard way. And that's the end of that chapter. And it's also the end of the book, end of book 7. Book 8 is coming next, and it's called The Last Day. Surprise. So, book 7, The Soldier in the Middle of the World, was written by Trish Mercer, published by Trish Mercer, and read by Trish Mercer. Thank you.